And we had an idea maybe that Brian was the 13th disciple, but he had a very demanding wife, and he was always late, so that, you know, he arrived 2 minutes after the water had been turned into wine, you know.
Missed everything.
And he missed everything, and that he never got to the Last Supper because his wife had friends coming round, and he was going to meet them at the Garden afterwards, and he went to a club called the Garden, you know.
Yeah.
Few comedies have provoked as much controversy or as much laughter as Monty Python's Life of Brian. Released in 1979, the film quickly became both a cult classic and a lightning rod for outrage. With its sharp satire of organized religion, political squabbles, and human absurdity, the movie was hailed by many as one of Monty Python's finest achievements. But for others, it was blasphemous, dangerous, and intolerable. Across parts of the United Kingdom, Ireland, Norway, and beyond, Life of Brian was banned or heavily restricted, in some cases for over 3 decades. The cultural climate of the late 70s. By the time Life of Brian was conceived, Monty Python had already established themselves as masters of absurdist and subversive humor. Their groundbreaking sketch series, Monty Python's Flying Circus, and films like Monty Python and the Holy Grail had shown that satire could reach mass audiences without losing its edge. By the late 70s, it was a time when religion, particularly Christianity, still held a powerful grip on public life in Britain and many other Western nations. In the UK, the Church of England wielded cultural authority, while in countries like Ireland and Norway, religious influence was even stronger. Questioning or mocking Christian doctrine wasn't seen as tasteless. For many, it was seen as a direct threat to social stability. Censorship boards were more active than they are today, and blasphemy laws still existed. At the same time, the 70s were marked by growing debates about freedom of expression. Musicians, comedians, and filmmakers were increasingly pushing boundaries, testing how far satire could go in critiquing politics, war, and faith. Against this backdrop, Monty Python decided to tackle one of the most sensitive subjects of all, the life and times surrounding Jesus Christ. Interestingly, the Pythons themselves were careful not to satirize Jesus directly. Instead, they created Brian Cohen, a hapless man born on the same day as Jesus who finds himself mistaken for the Messiah. The premise gave them room to explore themes of religious dogma, mob mentality, and the absurdity of human institutions, while avoiding direct parody of Christ himself. Still, nuance was quickly lost once the film's premise was made public. Release and immediate backlash. Life of Brian premiered in 1979, but not without difficulties. The original backer, EMI Films, pulled out just days before shooting began, fearing the project would be too controversial. Salvation came from an unlikely source, former Beatle George Harrison, who mortgaged his home to fund the film, famously describing it as, quote, the most expensive movie ticket ever bought. When the film finally reached cinemas, it was met with both acclaim and outrage. Critics praised its wit and boldness. Many viewers found it to be a sharp, hilarious critique of blind faith and bureaucracy, but church groups, religious leaders, and politicians condemned it as blasphemous. The film was banned outright in Ireland and Norway, while dozens of local councils in the UK also prohibited screenings. In fact, the ban in some Welsh towns lasted more than 30 years, only being lifted in the 21st century. The backlash was fueled not only by the film's content, but also by misconceptions. Many assumed the Pythons were mocking Jesus himself, despite the fact that the character of Christ appears briefly and is treated with respect. Instead, what the film lampooned was the way people interpreted and institutionalized religious teachings. Nonetheless, the perception of blasphemy was enough to ignite protests, boycotts, and public debates. One of the most famous confrontations came on British television when John Cleese and Michael Palin defended the film against critics, including the Bishop of Southwark, on a program called Friday Night, Saturday Morning. This heated exchange underscored how Life of Brian had become more than a comedy. It had turned into a battleground over free speech, religion, and the role of satire in society.
We tried this and we found it just didn't work, because the moment that you got near the figure of Christ, I mean really near, it just really wasn't funny, because Christ was wise and flexible and intelligent, and he didn't have any of the things that, I mean, comedy is about envy, right? Greed, malice, avarice, lust, stupidity.
Satire versus blasphemy. At the core of the controversy surrounding Life of Brian was a widespread misunderstanding. Many critics believed the film was mocking Jesus Christ himself. In reality, the Pythons were acutely aware of the line between satire and outright blasphemy. In fact, in interviews, they emphasized that Jesus is treated with dignity throughout the film. His brief appearance in the Sermon on the Mount sequence is portrayed with respect. The humor comes instead from the crowd at the back, mishearing his words and turning them into absurdities like, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." The distinction is crucial. The target of the comedy was not sacred figures or spiritual belief itself, but the human tendency to distort, organize, and weaponize religion. Brian's life becomes a parody of how dogmas are created. Followers cling to his discarded sandal as a holy relic, or demand simplistic teachings when he insists they think for themselves. This satire exposed the dangers of blind obedience and groupthink, making it less a critique of faith and more a critique of human behavior. Yet for many religious groups, the nuance was lost. The mere proximity of comedy to the story of Christ was enough to trigger accusations of sacrilege. In an era when blasphemy was still taken seriously as a legal and moral offense, Life of Brian became a lightning rod for anxieties about secularism, irreverence, and the erosion of traditional authority. The bans. The backlash quickly translated into censorship. In the UK, while the film passed national certification, dozens of local councils banned it outright. In some towns, particularly in Wales, where Sue Jones-Davies, who played Brian's love interest, would later become mayor, the prohibition lasted for over 30 years. This meant entire generations grew up without access to the film unless they traveled to neighboring areas where it was screened. Ireland took an even harder stance, banning the movie entirely upon release. Norway followed suit, refusing to allow screenings on the grounds of blasphemy. Ironically, this heavy-handed censorship only heightened the film's appeal. In Sweden, posters advertised it with the cheeky tagline, "So funny it was banned in Norway." The notoriety surrounding the bans helped solidify Life of Brian as a cultural event, sparking curiosity and rebellion among audiences who resented the paternalism of the censors. The persistence of these bans is striking. In Aberystwyth, Wales, the prohibition remained in place until 2009, when the town finally hosted its first legal screening, attended by none other than Sue Jones-Davies herself. By then, the absurdity of a 30-year ban on a comedy was clear to most, but the endurance of such restrictions highlights just how deeply entrenched religious sensitivities were at the time of the film's release. What makes this remarkable is not only the duration, but the diversity of contexts. The bans were not uniform, but they all reflected the same anxiety, that laughter could undermine faith, weaken institutions, and blur the line between reverence and ridicule. For the Pythons, this reaction validated their point. Human institutions, religious or otherwise, often cling to power through fear of mockery.
And we're writing the Life of Brian, and we're having a problem with the script. All of our characters are heading for crucifixion. So how are we going to end this movie? So I said, well, with a song. And they went, oh. And I said, yeah, we can sing it from the crosses.
Public debate and media spectacles. The controversy didn't remain confined to cinemas or church sermons. It spilled onto television screens and newspaper columns, turning into a national conversation about the limits of humor and the sanctity of religion. One of the most iconic moments came in 1979 on the BBC's Friday Night, Saturday Morning. John Cleese and Michael Palin appeared on the show to defend the film against Malcolm Muggeridge, a conservative commentator, and Mervyn Stockwood, the Bishop of Southwark. The program became infamous for the gulf between the sides. Cleese and Palin argued the film was not an attack on Jesus, but rather a satire on dogma, fanaticism, and the human tendency to misinterpret teachings. Muggeridge and Stockwood, however, dismissed the defense, insisting the film was blasphemous and dangerous. The exchange grew heated, with Palin in particular appearing visibly frustrated at how his explanations were ignored. What's striking in hindsight is how this televised confrontation symbolized a society in transition. The old guard, represented by church authorities and traditional commentators, sought to preserve reverence at all costs, while the new wave of artists and satirists demanded space to question, parody, and laugh at institutions once considered untouchable. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite Monty Python movie or sketch? Let us know in the comments section below.